It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert coming to you from Baltimore. It has been almost exactly 1 year since President Trump announced his new Afghanistan strategy, under which U.S. troop levels were eventually increased from 11,000 to 16,000 troops. However, as an article published on Thursday in the magazine Foreign Policy pointed out, 1 year on, little to show for Trump's Afghanistan strategy. According to the U.S. military, the Afghan government controls only 65% of the country's territory, with the rest under either Taliban or under contested control. According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Sweden, 20,000 people were killed in Afghanistan this year alone, making 2018 one of the deadliest years on record for the 17-year-old war. One person who is trying to push the Trump administration to adopt a new strategy is Erik Prince, the founder of Blackwater, the mercenary or private security firm. Prince is now head of a new company called Frontier Services Group. He also happens to be the brother of Betsy DeVos, Trump's Secretary of Education. Prince is advocating a return to the use of private contractors or mercenaries to replace U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Here's what he had to say recently about why this would be a good idea.
It's not a private army. It is a very clear delineation of who's in charge, okay? Afghan government working for a U.S. government official funded by the United States at a fraction of the cost of what we're spending now. All up, this is about a $3.5 billion package, saving more than $52 billion. If we leave decisions on warfare solely to the Pentagon, we will be at war forever. Well, we'll be here 17 years. You'll long since be retired, and we'll still be fighting in Afghanistan. Then we'll have our grandchildren going to Afghanistan. Enough is enough.
Joining me now to analyze the implications of Erik Prince's proposal is Antony Lowenstein. Antony is an independent journalist and author of the book Disaster Capitalism: Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Also, he is the writer and co-producer of the film Disaster Capitalism. Thanks for joining us today, Antony.
Thanks for having me.
So Erik Prince, as we saw in that clip just now, argues that his proposal to replace U.S. troops with mercenaries is not a privatization of the war effort because the soldiers are all under U.S. and Afghan control. What do you make of that argument?
It's a nonsense argument. I mean, let's just put this into perspective. When the US invaded in 2001, since then, the war has partly been privatized. The US, under the Bush administration, then Obama, and now Trump, have had thousands and thousands of private contractors, some mercenaries, some private security, some people who just, wash clothes and provide food. So the war, to some extent, has been privatized to an extent. But what Erik Prince is advocating for here, and I should say he's been advocating this for a while, when Trump became president, took power in early 2017, he was pretty quick out of the blocks, saying that the only way that the Afghan war could be saved, or I guess through implication that the US could win the war, was that the vast bulk of US troops should leave and he should provide US trained, I presume, mercenaries to somehow fight and win the war. When he's more honest about this, he's written about this in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, what he actually means is kind of a situation which is a quasi-colonial environment where there's a viceroy, that's his word, we should appoint a viceroy to run the country based in Kabul, presumably the capital, and this would somehow convince either the Taliban or other forces to lay down their arms or negotiate, which is a nonsense. And it's sort of a sad reality that Prince is still pushing this argument a year and a half into the Trump administration.
So one of Prince's main arguments in favor of replacing the U.S. military with mercenaries is that it would be cheaper and more effective, militarily speaking. Certainly reducing the number of soldiers by 2/3 from 16,000 to 5,000, which is, as I understand his proposal, would probably be cheaper. But what effect would such a move have on the country and on the conflict?
Well, the best people to answer that would be Afghans, and I have quite a few Afghan friends who are based in Kabul and elsewhere, and I've spoken to them about Prince's plans, both in the last few weeks since he's renewed his push to privatize the war in the last year and a half. They are petrified of the idea of this happening. Now, let me be clear. The war is a complete disaster now, putting aside Prince's plan. It's violent. People fear dying walking to work. It is an absolutely appalling situation. And there's no doubt that the US policy for literally 17 years has been a complete disaster for a range of reasons. One of the things that Prince talks about with a weird sense of honesty is that the US has been pushing a Soviet-style plan. The belief somehow that you can win hearts and minds was the initial plan after 2001. That was then abandoned in the last 6-12 months. The New York Times reported this a few months ago, that the US policy really these days is more to focus on large cities to try to hold that territory. The truth is that that's not actually working, because just the last couple of weeks, Afghan forces lost control of Ghazni, which is a city very close to Kabul, the capital. The situation is, I know you mentioned at the beginning of our interview that the Afghan government controls 60% of the country. That's a contested figure, I'd say. There's many people who argue on the ground that, in fact, the Taliban or associated groups have influence over far more territory. The problem with Prince's plan, if nothing else, is that when much of the war in the last 17 years has been privatised, there has been huge elements of private security moving around the country, Afghan and foreign. I've seen them. I've spent time with them. I've been to Afghanistan twice in the last 6 years. And the truth is, not all, but the majority of these private contractors often are unaccountable, often incredibly violent, killing a hell of a lot of civilians and not making people more secure. So essentially what Prince is arguing is that somehow that overwhelming force that apparently his mercenary army can provide will somehow convince or force the Taliban to the table to negotiate. At the moment, what's interesting is alongside Prince's idea is the Trump administration, in fact, is supposedly quite seriously pushing for some kind of peace negotiation. It's very hard to know how viable that is. And obviously, being Trump, we're very skeptical, rightly so. But there have been reports, legitimate reports in the last 6 months, that the US administration with the Afghan government is pushing for some kind of negotiation with the Taliban, both in Russia soon and also in Qatar. So the idea of Prince coming in with his plan, which I might add has been knocked back by the Trump administration, it's been knocked back by Trump himself and also many people at the Pentagon for good reasons. Not that, of course, the American government plan is working either, I might add, but Prince's plan certainly would not.
Well, touching on that issue about the possibility of this coming through, I mean, it's not a formal, hasn't even been really accepted, and it seems like most of the military, as you said, the Pentagon, have rejected the idea. And National Security Advisor John Bolton seemed to be kind of open, and it seems like Prince is placing his bets on Bolton that this will go through. How do you see the constellation of forces in this regard? That is, how likely do you see Prince's proposal of being implemented sometime in the near future?
That's a good question. The short answer is we don't know. But I'll be honest, we don't know. I think it's not that likely. I know there's been reports recently of John Bolton being maybe open to this, but those comments weren't coming from Bolton himself. They were coming from Erik Prince, which may be sort of a wish fulfillment on his part. Look, Bolton is obviously likes to, in his view, do radical things. I mean, that's obviously a viewpoint that would, I think, escalate the war in Afghanistan rather than solve it. The argument that says somehow that Trump would be attracted to this plan because it will save money, that's possible. And he's talked a lot during the 2016 election of how wasteful the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were, which was arguably true. But the truth is that the Pentagon is opposed to it. Much of the military is opposed to it. Although there were a lot of people in the military who ended up working for Blackwater and now Erik Prince aligned companies in the last 10, 15 years is true. But there's also a lot of skepticism and fear that the idea of introducing a private military army with a viceroy running the war from Kabul has any possibility of working. And also the question is, what is the outcome here? What is the ideal goal? Is the goal to supposedly win the war? 17 years, and at times over 150,000 foreign troops who are in Afghanistan could not win this war, whatever winning looks like, beating the Taliban, having an indefinite occupation, whatever that looks like. The idea that a handful of thousands of troops or military forces or private contractors or whatever Prince has in mind will solve this problem or win the war. The war is lost. That's the truth. And the sad reality for Afghans is that they are suffering that 17 years on. There needs to be a negotiated settlement between the Afghan government, the Taliban, associated forces, and of course the US and foreign forces, and I might add Pakistan, which is a key player in this, which often don't get talked about. Introducing Prince's plan, I think at the moment within the Trump administration, the majority of forces are opposed to it. But Trump being Trump, we can never rule out it may be happening. And if that is the case, it needs to be deeply opposed for the best reasons possible.
What you're saying actually kind of reminds me of the saying that Afghanistan is the burial ground of empires. But we'll leave it there for now.
So true.
I was speaking to Anthony Lowenstein, author of the book Disaster Capitalism: Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. Thanks again, Anthony, for having joined us today.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.